1930s, Ireland was living a time of changes, mostly because of the creation of the Irish Free State between 1922 and 1937 under the government of Eamon de Valera. The creation of the Irish Free State introduced a new desire for a Celtic revival among Ireland, highlighting the Irish language and the Celtic traditions. Those elements also applied to cinema. At the time, a lot of censure was applied on foreign cinema, and most of the films produced in Ireland were propaganda films used to promote the Celtic values that were suppressed under the British rule. The Isles of Aran were considered as an Irish language conservatory since the end of the 19th century, when a lot of Irish citizens decided to move to those isles. In order to cultivate potatoes, but the difficulties linked to the rocky soils of the lands forced 1/3 of the population of Inishmore, the isle where the movie Man of Aran was recorded, to leave the isle. Robert Flaherty is an American filmmaker with Irish origins from his father. He is considered as the father of the documentary genre. Flaherty was also considered an explorer and an ethnographer because he traveled all around the world to shoot his films. He is very famous for his film Nanook in the North, made in 1922, where he shows the life of American Indians, and for the film Man of Aran in 1934, where he shows the life of the Aran populations. This film shows different elements of the Aran's life, with the fishing, the difficulty linked to the cultivation of potatoes, and the way families were organized in order to solve those difficulties. Our extract shows a scene where the family works by the sea to find seaweed to help them cultivate potatoes. These scenes happened at the beginning of the film, just after the kayak scene where a storm begins and the men are caught in it, while the women and the children are watching them trying to get out of the storm. Our extract shows how hard the life was on the Isles, but it also highlights the type of nuclear family that were highly represented in Ireland at these times. This sequence made us ask ourselves this question: in what way is this sequence an illustration of the controversies and critics that Flaherty received about his film? To answer this question, we will go through those axes: the confrontation between a man and his environment, an harmonious and united dimension of the sequence, and an aesthetic vision of reality.
The title of the film, Man of Aran, gives from the beginning the main actors of the movie. First of all man, and then nature, with the island of Aran. We will see that the first relationship in which these two characters are involved is the conflict, a strong opposition. Indeed, nature is omnipresent and impressive, so much that man in comparison seems quite fragile. This majesty of nature is brought to the forefront from the first seconds of a sequence, with a series of different extreme long shots on the Aran landscapes. First, there is a long shot showing the cliffs and the sea below, and then there is another one illustrating the very steep and dangerous aspect of these cliffs, which flood the whole space and thus impress the viewer. Then there is a wider shot, where the cliffs are beaten by the waves. The next shot focuses on the sea and the waves filling the screen. Finally, there is a shot similar to the first one, with the only difference that the camera pans to see stretches of land before a freeze shot on a village. The succession of these plans shows how wild and untamed this nature still is. In this context, the use of long shots is useful to show nature in its most imposing and raw aspect. This is why the appearance of a mark of civilization with the village, seems almost weird as nature seems to dominate the whole space. The counterpart of all this is that man seems to be completely submissive to this nature that dominates it. The high-angle shot seems like crushing the mother and her child to perhaps show their insignificance and smallness in front of the nature that surrounds them. We find the suspect of nature ready to engulf men at other moments, and in an even more eloquent way. Indeed, many times, the long shot is used, which allows the characters to be incorporated into their grandiose environment. Nature then seems to almost swallow them up, and man seems very weak in the face of these imposing landscapes. So here it is not very clear, but the character is just here in the very bottom of the image. So there is a distance shot where we can see the woman walking in the distance and the sky occupying almost all the space, showing once again the minor aspect that the woman occupies in front of the immensity of nature. But then, as she is moving, there is a low-angle shot, as if she succeeded in overcoming the obstacles nature put on her path. Moreover, some establishing shots show the vast expanse of land, but few of them are immediately arable. The land is indeed very rocky and arid, and the subsistence of these inhabitants depends on agriculture. So the man must fight against nature, and at the cost of much effort, he eventually succeeds in cultivating this land. In fact, when man tries to break the rock, he is filmed with a low-angle shot and a close shot, which can highlight that man too is capable of dominating this land, however rough it may be. It is almost like a fight between David and Goliath, because man is so fragile compared to the land, and thanks to the succession of shots, we can see how hard it is to swing a mallet over his head to crush rocks over and over again. So now we're going to see that man is indeed in a constant struggle with nature to make a place for himself, but he is also fighting with it for his survival. Indeed, this nature gives nothing of itself. All that man needs is has to struggle to get it at the cost of great efforts. Man must wrest his sustenance from the land. Indeed, from the outset of our sequence, the subtitle announces the issues and challenges that the characters are facing. It says, "The land upon which men of Aran depends for his subsistence, potatoes, has not even soil. Thus, there is a bond of dependence between men and the land, since it is the survival of the latter that is at stake. Nevertheless, this vital link is jeopardized by the fact that this island in itself is not capable of directly providing the fertile soil necessary for cultivation. So even before being able to cultivate the potato, man has to make the soil before sowing. So it's the hard labor of these peasants that Flaherty's camera shows us. The difficulty of this work in the field is perceptible in different scenes and through the struggle of the characters. To begin with, we can see that with the long shot showing the woman hauling seaweed on her back, that were used to sow potatoes in the scant soil, she seems to be bending and struggling to walk because of the weight of her load. So the effort is also visible with the close shot, which allows to see the effort on the face of the woman trying to retrieve soil in a crevice. Moreover, the dubbing, the soundtrack, and the sound effects help us to understand the intensity of the effort. For example, when they have to pull or carry a load, you can hear sighs of effort. Sound is therefore useful to better reflect the difficulty of the work. The same phenomenon can be observed when the man swings a mallet over his head to crush rocks in the field, because his moves are punctuated with dramatic chords. So now I will let you hear an extract of this music. So as a matter of fact, and as you probably heard, the music emphasizes its effort. We can also see the arduousness of this work in the scene where a group of individuals crosses the sea with donkey loaded with varech. which is a mixture of different seaweed collected along the coast and used as fertilizer. This varech was certainly collected in one of the scenes preceding our sequence, and it also shows the risks taken by these people because the woman was almost swept away by the tide. In the scene where the group walks in the water, there is a high-angle shot and then a tracking shot, which allows to follow their rhythm and to have a clearer vision of the difficulty of that, because at some point the woman falls. So finally, we will see that the struggle of these peasants is obvious here. But what is interesting to note is that it does not seem to be an empirical struggle. Indeed, one gets the impression that what they endure, the difficulties they face in order to be able to feed themselves, are not only inherent to their time, but rather a sine qua non condition of life for anyone who would like to survive on this island. To make this clear, we could first of all refer to the title. Indeed, Men of Aran symbolizes here the figure of the father, the man, but it could also be the figure of the man in a more general way on this island. The subtitle added to the scene and which says, "For 1,000 years, men of Aran have searched such crevices for soil," could be an illustration of that. Indeed, it could mean that this is the way men used to do in the past, and that it is still the case in the movie, so it could give life on this island a kind of timelessness. In fact, the methods used seem to be the same for hundreds of years. Actually, only the men crossing this land have changed. So, moreover, the fact that the characters have no first name may be part of this desire to show that no matter who the inhabitants are, only the island and the way people live there matter. We can see an example of this timelessness when the woman hauls seaweed on her back. Indeed, in this scene, there is a long shot. The camera stays still, whereas the woman moves forward and gradually disappears from the screen. Metaphorically and symbolically speaking, one could analyze this scene as the testimony of the immutability of this land. Indeed, men are only passing through, but the island remains. The film is not the testimony of the life of its inhabitants at the time of shooting, but the search for the very essence of this life and this island.
As we said just before, there is clearly an opposition between man and his environment in the sequence we are commenting on. It is showing and even maybe emphasizing the daily struggle of Aran Islanders against nature and the difficulties that people are dealing with in order to farm, to feed the land and feed themselves, at least to survive. There is nevertheless something else that can be noticeable and significant in the extract. Indeed, the images that Flaherty composed are showing a certain union between men and nature, between men themselves, and it creates also an effect of harmony that can be confronted to reality. But at first, we can focus on the fact that there is a union between man and nature. Indeed, we can see that this union we just talked about can be seen in the composition of some shots. The relationship between man and nature is not only difficult, laborious, or conflictual, as we can see really the union between man and nature in the extract. And this union can be seen physically in the position, in the attitude, the gesture of all men. For instance, we can see just here in the composition of this image that Man of Aran, even though he is having a short break in his laborious efforts, He has his feet at ground level and head at sky level. His silhouette in the middle of the image appears more as a shape which fits well in the landscape, and we can draw a parallel in the composition of these shots, maybe with the romantic painting of the German painter Caspar David Friedrich, entitled Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. More generally, the connection between man and nature in the sequence is obviously emphasized and even created sometimes by the different types of shots and angles of the camera, which can put an emphasis on some parts of the body in actions, or as the camera follows the journey, follows the harsh work to be done. So yeah, we can see that it definitely plays a role in catching those efforts of people working, farming the land, and always with an aesthetic dimension which conveys that union. And in the whole sequence, the most remarkable thing about men is probably that they are filmed in their relation to nature, and even more than just a relation, we can go further and say that it could be a sort of devotion to nature, to his environment. And the different choices of the camera angles are, yes, they certainly contribute to create this sort of union of connection, even though this can be forced and maybe compelled to some extent. In this scene, there is the inscription on the screen which says "Seaweed, the foundation of their farms." So we can say that in this short sentence we have the word seaweed and foundation, which means that seaweed as something part of nature, and the word foundation, it's really significant of the fact that there is a union between man and nature, as seaweed being the foundation of the farm, on the foundation on the thing that can make them just stay alive and continue to live on this island. So as we said, there is a connection, a union between man and his natural environment, but we can now also say that there is a union between all the inhabitants of Aran Island who are working the land. Indeed, even though they do not all have the same tasks or works, they are definitely cooperating. For instance, the mother just here, whose task is to take and bear the seaweed to bring it from the coast to the cultivable land just here. And those scenes are showing the fact that the work must be collective, that men must help each other, and it creates, it calls a sense of solidarity, fraternity, that those values emerges from those scenes. And for instance, there is the recurring image of the couple that we can see here, man of Aran and his wife. So yeah, we can see them several times during the sequence, whether they are both present on the same shot or by interposed scenes. We can also notice the moments of dialogue, even though it is in Gaelic language, such as in this scene where the man is talking to the girls above him to give them a basket, so the moments of dialogue always corresponds to moments of communication, always around the purpose of co-working. There is the idea that they are not talking just to there is no plot, there is not really a plot, so the fact that they are talking is just to in the purpose of co-working every time. So those images of solidarity, of co-working, and of men in connection with nature are actually showing a certain harmony in the sequence. And the global harmony is also rendered and emphasized by the music and its rhythm. For instance, at the end of the sequence, we can hear a harmonious and peaceful music as they finally all reached their everyday goal, and it could correspond to a resolution, a moment of denouement, when the tension of their actions finally comes down, leading to a peaceful moment, which is, as I said before, supported by the music. And it corresponds to the last seconds of the extract, when we can see filmed from a high angle shot. We can see them working with the soil. With the ants, the ants are quite important in the sequence as the image of them cultivating that soil which is finally fertile. There is that sense of harmony that comes at the end, particularly in the music, that we cannot hear here, but there is definitely a coherence between the music and the images, as Marie-Amélie said in the first part. Now we can talk about the effect of this harmony and how this effect created by Flaherty can be confronted with the reality of Aran Island at the beginning of the 20th century. So, with this harmony, which is created by the image and which results from the images of the sequence, we can understand Flaherty's desire to create life through work, through a certain cohesion of the people. We can also notice that the natural environment tends towards a kind of return to a Garden of Eden, maybe, in the sense that it starts from an arid, just to show you, it starts from an arid, rocky and non-fertile ground, and that thanks to man's efforts we tend to return to this religious imagery I mentioned just before, with the fact that the soil can be now fertile. So there is the idea that thanks to man's efforts, they can maybe come back to a lost Garden of Eden. There is also the presence of animals in several scenes, such as the sheep, and also the horse, and the presence of animals maybe participates in rendering that effect of Garden of Eden, and more particularly for this shot. So yeah, this close shot on the head of the white horse is maybe also to show that animals also cooperate, even though those animals are not playing an essential role on the work. We can notice easily that the horses do just here, as men need horses to bear all the seaweed they brought from the sea. So yes, this idea of kind of return to a Garden of Eden could be a way maybe to not to see but to interpret the scene and the potential effect that the harmony creates. But we can also wonder if these efforts represented as rewarded and glorious, is it giving finally a romanticized image of Aran Islands, in the sense that at the beginning of the 20th century, men withdrew from the islands to return to the country because the living condition or rather survival conditions were way too difficult to bear. So, in a nutshell, the romantic and lyrical vision that Flaherty wanted to give of the Aran Islands and its inhabitants collides rapidly with the historical reality of the experience of the people of Aran Island.
In this extract, Flaherty chose to represent the typical working day of Aran's inhabitants using a superposition of different static shoots, showing on one side the tasks of the mother and on the other one the tasks of the father, those tasks being reunited at the end of the day. Flaherty chose to show the difficulties of the association of work and family life and how the Arans felt with those difficulties. To turn his film, Flaherty chose to immerse himself on the Aran society to understand the local way of life. Those elements and his need to understand the locals' living conditions allowed him to gain the title of father of the documentary and ethnographic fiction. It is true that Flaherty represented the families, the dress codes, and the villages as they probably were at the time, but Flaherty also decided not to refer to some very important aspects of the Irish life. For example, the scene depicting the mother carrying a basket of seaweed on her back satisfy an aesthetic portal of the Celtic values, but that technique was not really used by the islanders. Moreover, contrary to the impression given by the film, about half the surface of the island was covered by soil to help fertilize the lands, so it was not as difficult as it seems in the film for the islanders to find that precious soil. Flaherty's first purpose was to demonstrate the capability of the human spirit to endure a harsh environment and not to show the exact reality of life in the Inishmo Isle. There are more serious omissions about the inhabitants of the Aran Islands, who holds deeply beliefs about the religious influences on the course of life. But Flaherty chose not to include any evidence of religious commitments. The complete omission of these significant aspects of Irish life makes us believe that Flaherty never intended Man of Aran to be a faithful representation of the Irish practices, but more an aesthetic representation of man against nature. Flaherty is filming his sequence in a romantic way, showing his creativity as an artist. It is also important to say that Flaherty was an amazing photographer, mostly in Toronto, and his skills as an imagist are felt in this sequence. Every scene is majestically represented with shoots of the sea and the sky among the characters, like we can see in this picture. Even the family was constructed around the need for photogenic faces using actors. Flaherty used panoramic shots of the characters against landscapes and seascapes, where the characters are often reduced to silhouettes. In his work, Flaherty is playing with lights and shadows, but also with a superposition of high and low angle shoot to dramatize some of the scenes. We can see that in the rock breaking scene there, where the camera captures the father in a low angle shot. He dominates the frame, standing above the camera as he lifts the hammer above his head. There is a series of rapid shots showing the action from a number of different perspectives in a way to emphasize the character's physical strength and determination. The combination of shooting style and framing gave an heroic dimension to the father and an epic dimension to a very common task. These techniques is also used for the mother carrying a basket full of seaweeds, looking heroic under the seascapes. The aesthetic values of Flaherty forced the cinema to create a new kind of genre between documentary and fiction, creating debates at the release of the film in 1934. Man of Aran was promoted and largely accepted in Ireland as a realistic portrayal of life in the Aran's Isles, and that was part of the huge attractions towards the films at the time, precisely because it's so-called realism that matched with the propaganda and the Celtic revival of the island of the early 1930s. This acceptation of the film had a profoundly nationalist dimension. At the time of its release in 1934, the film was received as a realistic representation of the Aran Islands, its romanticism mistaken for a social realism. The image of the islanders that the film promoted echoed with the Irish nationalist movement at the time, and seemed to offer material to Eamon de Valera's own vision of an island of labour and self-sufficiency. That's why the film was not censored. Man of Aran have been deeply significant for the development of filmmaking in Ireland. The way in which a particular form of Irish identity was imagined have become an important point of departure for the Irish revival cinema. Even if Flaherty was not interested in political representation, his movie was used as a propaganda for nationalist Ireland. Man of Aran is the perfect example of an artistic work which has been diverted from the author's intention to serve a completely different interpretation. The blur between a documentary and a romantic fiction created by Flaherty in his film created debates among the audience considering the genre of the film.
As a conclusion, we can come back on the elements we worked on to answer our problematic, which was in what ways or to what extent is this sequence an illustration of the controversies and critics that Flaherty received about this film. So we have first started with the analysis of the sequence by saying that it corresponds to a confrontation between man and his environment, that man can first seem insignificant compared to the greatness and certain power of nature, and that he must fight to survive in such conditions, because we really see that man has to fight to get the sustenance of the soil. Then we said that despite a confrontation between man and his environment, there was nevertheless a representation of a certain union between man and nature, and also of man between them, which can correspond to a value of solidarity, and also that the fact that the editing and the different shots and angles, and also the music, all participate mostly to this harmonious whole emanating from the sequence. We could have even drawn a parallel between this sense of harmony and the kind of prowess of finally forming the land, which can be compared to a kind of return or rediscovery of the Garden of Eden. However, to some extent, as long as we know that there was a huge gap between what was shown and represented by Flaherty and the actual reality. But as we said it in the last part, the sequence is blurring the limits between reality and fiction. We can see that it illustrates well the controversies that Flaherty received for his film, if we can admit that it is certain manipulation of reality. But it still represents a recurring subject regarding Aran Island and its inhabitants, which can be the timelessness struggle for man and his environment. And whether the film as a documentary or a fiction, or maybe a kind of hybrid material composed of both, which corresponds pretty well to Flaherty's style, there is undeniably a great aesthetic and poetic dimension in the sequence, and in the movie as a whole. Whatever the political or non-political intentions are, whether it could be a Celtic revival or a kind of propaganda. So our sequence can bear some of the criticisms of Flaherty's work, but it's another scene that we can see here, which is the shark scene. And that scene is more famous and comes later in the film, and this is the scene that really challenged the documentary level of this production.